Nightfall should have brought silence. Instead, it brought the sound of boots pounding on wet pavement, a storm of voices rising from every street corner, and the unmistakable hum of a nation losing control. New York, capital of ambition, cathedral of American wealth, was drowning in panic. Banks had locked their doors, telegraph lines buzzed with rumors of ruin. And somewhere in the middle of it all, men in tailored coats clutched their breaths the way soldiers hold rifles on the eve of battle. People lined up outside trust companies, their faces gray in the gaslight. They pulled at the doors even after the locks clicked shut, convinced that persistence could change fate. But by this night in 1907, nothing could. The money was gone, faith had evaporated, and every conversation felt like the last whisper before an execution. America had entered a financial vacuum, and in a world powered by credit, a vacuum wasn't empty, it was lethal. Inside the corridors of Washington, senators murmured about martial law. Newspapers prepared morning headlines predicting the unthinkable, the collapse of the American banking system. Factories were closing. Trains full of goods sat still at rail yards like frozen arteries in a dying body. Mothers hoarded bread. Men dug for savings hidden beneath floorboards. No institution had enough cash. No official had enough authority. No one had a plan. Except one man. While the country spiraled, J. Pierpont Morgan sat beneath a stained glass dome in his private library, an iron-walled sanctum built more like a fortress than a financier's office. Outside, the city trembled. Inside, only the crackle of a fireplace broke the silence, glowing off shelves lined with manuscripts older than the Republic itself. Morgan did not join the panic. He studied it. Because the night America collapsed was also the night he finally gained what he had spent decades building toward: absolute leverage. The bankers who only days earlier competed with him were now flooding into his mansion, pale, sweating, desperate. They begged for instructions, not negotiations. Morgan listened with the stillness of a surgeon preparing for the first incision. He understood something they didn't, that chaos compresses power. That in moments like this, entire nations could be reshaped by a signature, a nod, a closed door. He paced the room slowly, letting the fear thicken. Every tick of the clock tightened the noose around the American economy. By sunrise, institutions employing tens of thousands could fall like dominoes. But Morgan knew how fragile the system truly was, because he had helped build it that way. Interconnected, leveraged, vulnerable to the slightest tremor. A house of glass resting on the shoulders of men too comfortable to question who controlled the foundation. As midnight crept in, the crowd of bankers waited for Morgan's verdict like civilians trapped in a bunker. They asked him how to stop the collapse, how to restore confidence, how to save the country. Morgan did not answer immediately. He wanted them to feel it, the weight of depending on a single man. The realization that the entire financial architecture of the United States had narrowed to the width of his shadow. Across the city, people clung to hope that daylight would deliver salvation. But they didn't know that salvation, if it came, would not be an act of mercy. It would be a transaction, a deal brokered in darkness, a debt the country would spend a century repaying. Because on this night, America wasn't merely collapsing, it was being purchased. And the man signing the bill of sale was already waiting for the ink to dry. Crises are never accidents. They feel sudden, violent, unpredictable, but only to those who mistake the smoke for the fire. Look closely at America's financial history, and a different picture emerges. A rhythm, a pulse, a pattern so precise it appears engineered. Every generation suffers a once-in-a-century disaster, yet it happens every few decades. Every panic destroys the weak and elevates the few. And standing at the center of this repeating storm, like a conductor of controlled destruction, was J. Pierpont Morgan. Long before the panic of 1907, the blueprint had already been tested. In 1873, America was still recovering from the Civil War when credit began to dry up. Railroad companies, bloated, leveraged, poorly regulated, started to fail. Newspapers declared it an act of God. Investors called it bad luck. But Morgan saw the truth. When credit is the oxygen of the economy, the one who controls the oxygen controls the flame. And in a world suffocating from fear, he was the man holding the air valve. He bought assets for pennies. He absorbed competitors. He emerged from the ashes richer, larger, and more essential than ever. 2 decades later, the script repeated itself. The panic of 1893 ripped through the country like a silent hurricane. More than 500 banks collapsed. Nearly 20% of railroads vanished. Families lost everything. But inside Morgan's offices, the crisis looked less like a natural disaster and more like an opportunity, a slow-motion liquidation sale of the American economy. Again, he stepped in, not out of charity, but out of strategy. Buying distressed assets, merging broken companies into obedient giants, and weaving his influence deeper into the nation's financial bloodstream. Each collapse revealed the same law. When the public panics, power consolidates. When institutions crumble, empires rise. And Morgan understood this law better than anyone alive. He didn't just react to chaos, he counted on it. Crisis was the scalpel he used to carve the future. Panic was the smokescreen that let him reshape the markets without resistance. When people are terrified, they don't argue, they surrender. They accept any savior who promises stability. And Morgan, with his iron stare and cathedral-like office, played the role flawlessly. By the early 1900s, he wasn't just a banker, he was the system. Railroads answered to him. Industrial titans sought his approval. Even presidents consulted him in private. The public imagined Wall Street as a battlefield of competing giants. But behind the curtains, most roads led back to one man. He had built a network of trusts, alliances, proxy holdings, and silent partnerships so intricate that even seasoned financiers whispered that Morgan's influence was larger than the government itself. Still, his power had one limitation. It was informal. Enormous, yes, but unofficial. It lived in shadows, handshakes, secret meetings, and coded telegrams. And Morgan knew shadow power, no matter how vast, would always be fragile unless legitimized by crisis. Because a nation will never willingly surrender control. It must be frightened into doing so, which is why the panic of 1907 was not a random eruption of instability. It was the culmination of decades of structural engineering, a financial house built on leveraged towers, trust companies dependent on uninsured deposits, and markets addicted to speculation. A system so delicately balanced that a whisper could break it, and a whisper did. When the crisis hit, Morgan didn't just step into the void, he prepared the void. He waited for the exact moment when terror peaked and alternatives vanished. Only then did he open his doors, not as a borrower or lender, but as a ruler. Bank presidents lined up at his mansion like vassals summoned to court. Senators spoke of him as the only man who could stop the bleeding. Newspapers declared him the savior of capitalism. But this was the pattern. Engineer dependency, trigger panic, offer rescue, expand control. A cycle disguised as salvation. Every collapse made him stronger. Every crisis pulled the country closer into his orbit. Every headline praising his heroism obscured the truth that America wasn't drifting into centralization by accident. It was being guided step by step toward a future where financial power would no longer be scattered among private kings, but concentrated into a single institution with near-divine authority, a central bank, a Federal Reserve, a fortress of power built on the ruins of panic. All that remained was the final crisis, the one dramatic enough to convince a divided nation to surrender its monetary soul. And Morgan, more than anyone, knew that history rewards the man who stands at the center of a collapse. Because in America, catastrophe is not the end of the cycle. It is the beginning of control. If you strip away the sepia tones of old photographs, if you mute the crackling sound of antique newsreels, the panic of 1907 doesn't look like history. It looks like a mirror. a warning, a blueprint repeating itself across generations, disguised only by new logos, new technologies, and new titans wearing modern suits instead of waistcoats. Because what J.P. Morgan engineered in the early 20th century didn't die with him. It evolved. In 1907, crowds stormed trust companies demanding withdrawals. In 2008, it was people refreshing collapsing stock tickers on glowing screens, watching their retirement vanish in real time. In 1907, Morgan locked bankers in a room until they submitted to his plan. In 2008, federal officials and CEOs huddled in conference rooms past midnight, rewriting the rules of capitalism behind closed doors. Different century, same choreography. The names have changed, Morgan is gone, but the architecture he created lives on. Today we call it too big to fail, a phrase that sounds like protection, but functions as a threat. In Morgan's era, one man stood at the center of the storm. Today, it's an invisible network of financial giants: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. Firms that don't just manage money, they manage the lifeblood of entire nations. They hold pieces of every corporation, every sector, every government bond market. They are the modern trusts, sprawling, intertwined, impossible to regulate, and capable of freezing global markets with a single misstep. The Panic of 1907 was triggered by a failed speculation scheme. The Panic of 2008 was triggered by a derivative implosion. The next panic? It may come from a liquidity crisis, a shadow bank run, or an algorithmic cascade. The surface changes, the mechanism stays the same. Interconnected systems amplify tiny fractures into global catastrophes. Morgan used crisis to consolidate power. Today, crises consolidate control under central banks. The Federal Reserve, an institution born from Morgan's influence, now plays the role he once held alone. When markets tremble, the Fed steps in with the same calm authority, the same carefully measured voice, the same promise of stability in exchange for obedience. It buys toxic assets, props up failing giants, and injects liquidity at will, not as a suggestion, as a command. And just like Morgan's interventions, each rescue comes with invisible strings. After 1907, Morgan emerged as the unofficial ruler of American finance. After 2008, central banks emerged as the official rulers of the global economy. History didn't move on, it scaled up. The same dynamic that once applied to railroads now applies to entire continents. One glitch in London can freeze markets in Tokyo. A tremor on Wall Street can ripple into billions of lives within minutes. Our financial system is a single, sprawling organism, one shock away from paralysis. Exactly the kind of system Morgan understood, cultivated, and mastered. And here is the parallel that should make your bloodstream run cold. In 1907, the crisis justified creating the Federal Reserve. In 2020 to 2023, crises justified expanding its power beyond anything Morgan could have dreamed of. Unlimited bond buying, direct market intervention, control over interest rates that determine the fate of world currencies. The same narrative returns on a loop. There is no alternative. Only the central authority can save us. It's the language of dependency, polished, modern, wrapped in technocratic vocabulary, but identical to the plea of bankers who once gathered beneath stained glass in Morgan's library. And just like those men, today's leaders aren't in control. They're managed, guided, quietly steered by a system that grew from Morgan's blueprint. A system that thrives on fragility, expands through crisis, and hides behind the illusion of public service. History is not a line, it is a cycle, and the cycle is accelerating. The panic that crowned Morgan king now echoes in every market crash, every emergency bailout, every quiet weekend meeting where unelected officials decide the fate of billions. What happened in 1907 wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the prototype. And whether we admit it or not, we are still living inside the machinery he built. older, larger, and more dangerous than ever. There is a moment in every story where the curtain slips just an inch, and you see the machinery beneath the stage, the gears, the levers, the hands that were never meant to be visible. For J.P. Morgan, that moment didn't happen during his lifetime. It happened decades later as pieces of a hidden truth finally surfaced. The realization that America's greatest savior may have orchestrated the very disaster he was praised for stopping. It begins with a question so simple it feels dangerous. How did a single man become the solution to a national catastrophe, unless he was also part of the cause? In the months leading up to the panic of 1907, Morgan quietly withdrew support from several key institutions, trust companies that were rising competitors to his own financial empire. These trusts were independent, less regulated, and increasingly powerful. They represented a future where Morgan was not the undisputed monarch of American credit. He couldn't control them, he couldn't corral them, but he could weaken them. And then, perfect timing, rumors began to spread. Rumors about insolvency, mismanagement, hidden losses. Rumors that started small, then caught fire. No one ever traced their source with certainty, but historians noticed a chilling pattern. The whispers always benefited Morgan. The panic always hit his rivals hardest. And when depositors stampeded to withdraw their funds, trust companies collapsed like hollow statues. The crisis cleared the battlefield for him, yet his influence didn't end there. During the height of the collapse, Morgan selected which banks lived, which died, and which would be absorbed into his domain. He framed it as triage, necessary to save the system. But behind closed doors, it looked far more strategic. Institutions that cooperated with Morgan's interests found lifelines. Those who resisted drowned. One by one, competitors vanished, and Morgan's empire grew like a shadow stretching across the continent. But the darkest secret wasn't economic, it was constitutional. Because in 1907, while the nation begged him for salvation, Morgan crossed a line no private citizen should ever cross. He seized the powers of the U.S. Treasury. With President Roosevelt sidelined, Congress paralyzed, and Washington humiliated, Morgan issued orders that should have belonged to the federal government, directing liquidity injections, commanding gold shipments, and determining credit flows for the entire country. A single man had become America's central bank, not by law, but by necessity, not elected, but obeyed. And here is the revelation that twists the knife. This wasn't a spontaneous takeover, it was the rehearsal. Within 5 years, Morgan's allies, including Senator Nelson Aldrich, father-in-law of the Rockefeller dynasty, assembled on a remote island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island, a private hunting club owned by America's wealthiest families. No journalists, no transcripts, no public record. Only 7 men, all tied directly to Morgan's banking network, drafting a plan to replace America's scattered financial landscape with a single, centralized entity, the Federal Reserve. The architecture was Morgan's, the philosophy was Morgan's, the crisis justification was Morgan's, and the secrecy, down to the fake names they used on the train ride, was pure Morgan. The public was told the Federal Reserve was a government institution created to protect the people. But it was designed by the bankers it was supposedly meant to regulate. And at the heart of it all lay the same pattern Morgan perfected. Manufacture fragility, ignite panic, demand centralization, enshrine control. He never revealed this hidden design. He never admitted how deeply he sculpted the financial DNA of the modern world. He left behind an image of a stern patriarch, a benevolent titan, the man who saved America. But that image cracks when you realize the truth. J.P. Morgan saved the country only after ensuring he was the one the country needed saving from. Behind every headline praising him, behind every painting depicting his grandeur, behind every myth about his heroism, is a darker legacy. The creation of a system where crises are not accidents, but instruments. where power moves upward during disaster, where the elites who break the economy become the only ones trusted to fix it. Morgan didn't just manipulate markets, he manipulated destiny, and the world we live in, centralized, fragile, governed by invisible financial monarchies, is his final monument. A monument built not of stone, but of dependency, not of gold, but of obedience, not for the people, but for the architects of collapse. The secret he took to his grave wasn't a crime. It was a blueprint. There's a strange quiet that settles after a revelation, an almost electric stillness, like the air just before a storm breaks open. When you understand what Morgan built, what he manipulated, what he left behind, you begin to see the world differently. Markets stop looking like numbers, banks stop looking like institutions, and history stops looking like progress. It becomes a cycle, a machine, a script replaying itself in new costumes. Morgan is gone, entombed in marble and mythology, but the architecture he engineered, this fragile, crisis-driven, central-controlled financial order, never died. It simply changed its face. It moved from mahogany libraries to digital dashboards, from smoke-filled back rooms to algorithmic trading floors, from the authority of one man to the quiet, unaccountable power of entire institutions. And now, more than a century later, you can feel the tremor of the next turn in the cycle. Debt levels higher than at any point in history, banks swollen with leverage, governments addicted to money printing, markets walking on glass. A global economy built not on stability, but on the borrowed confidence of millions who no longer understand how the system truly works. The pattern is the same. If dependency is the goal, fragility is the tool. If control is the destination, crisis is the doorway. Morgan weaponized that logic in 1907. The Federal Reserve weaponized it in 2008. And today, through every emergency stimulus, every temporary intervention, every manufactured sense of security, the cycle tightens. We are told the system is safer. We are told the watchdogs are wiser. We are told the institutions designed in Morgan's shadow now exist to protect us. But look closer. Every rescue expands their reach. Every collapse justifies more authority. Every panic pulls one more lever out of the hands of the public and places it into the grasp of the same elite machinery Morgan once commanded alone. This is the inevitability baked into the system. The more centralized a structure becomes, the more catastrophic its failures, and the more absolute its solutions. And yet, there is one fracture in the design Morgan never anticipated: awareness. He operated in a world where the public could be kept ignorant, where financial architecture could be drawn in secrecy, where panic could be molded without resistance. But today, the shadows are thinner. The old myths are cracking. People are beginning to understand the cycle, not as an act of fate, but as an act of engineering. Knowledge doesn't dismantle the machine, but it exposes its gears. And once you see the gears turning, once you recognize the pattern repeating, panic begins to lose its bite. Authority begins to lose its aura. And the architects of collapse, the modern Morgans, lose the one thing they depend on most: blind trust. Maybe the cycle won't end in our lifetime. Maybe the forces Morgan set in motion are too vast, too entrenched, too deeply woven into the DNA of modern finance. But cycles are not cages, they are warnings. And warnings, unlike panics, give us time. Time to prepare, time to question, time to choose a future not written by the ghosts of men who bought empires for pennies in the dark. Because if the last century taught us anything, it is this: power built on crisis will always search for the next one. But power exposed, power understood, can no longer rule in the same way. The cycle may be inevitable, but submission to it is not.